Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Ladies and gentlemen, today is the 5th of August 2020. A year has passed since Articles 370 and 35A were abrogated by the Indian government, thus curtailing the rights of the people of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir even further. Do we see a ray of light in the region? Do we see a reinstatement of these articles? Do we see tensions kind of minimizing in the region in the coming days? Do we see pressure of different countries on India having some kind of result? To talk about that and more, we've been joined by the 27th President of Azad, Jammu and Kashmir and diplomat himself, Sardar Masood Khan. Sir, thank you very much to have joined us.
Thank you for having me.
Sir, is there any ray of light? Is there any hope for the reinstatement of Articles 370 and 35A?
There's no ray of hope. There's no ray of light. The situation in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir in the past year has darkened and it has deteriorated. This past year has been hell for the Kashmiris, because you would recall that on August the 5th last year, the Indian occupation forces invaded the territory, besieged it, and they have been colonizing the territory ever since. On August the 5th, they started these illegal steps, and on October the 31st and November the 1st, they divided the territory, the occupied territory, into two parts and called them union territories, which means that these territories would be ruled directly by Delhi, not by the people of these territories. So this is effective colonization and foreign occupation. So this is one aspect. The other thing is that they have shown the occupied territory, the disputed territory, recognized as such by the United Nations as part of the Indian Federation, or the Indian Union as it is called. So this is usurpation of a foreign land, because Kashmir doesn't belong to India. The people of Jammu and Kashmir have to decide and determine their future in accordance with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. The third thing that has happened is that on April the 2nd this year, India released or issued these domicile rules, and in accordance with these rules, they are importing Hindus from all over India, different parts of India, and settling them in Kashmir to change the demographic composition of the occupied state. This is a violation of the 4th Geneva Convention, the ICC Statute, Additional Protocol 1, international law, international humanitarian law, and United Nations Security Council resolutions on the subject, in addition to the UN Security Council resolutions on Kashmir. Now, what Kashmiris have seen in the past year is killings, torture, incarceration, and deprivation of all their rights, forced disappearances. They have lost their economic means, their livelihoods have been attacked, their land is being grabbed. So what you see in Kashmir, the occupied territory, is a humanitarian crisis, a crisis of the kind which no other part of the world has witnessed in the 21st century.
When you talk of this crisis, wasn't this the design of Narendra Modi-led government since the very beginning?
Yes, it was. Go back to 2014, and they had an election manifesto which was repeated in 2019 elections and also expanded. And they had committed to rescind Articles 370 and 35A, but that was not all, because they had developed these designs to colonize the territory and to change its demography and to change its geographical and political or territorial status. And this is precisely what they have done. You know, when they came to Kashmir last year as occupiers and as invaders, they said that they are ushering in prosperity, economic development, peace and security, that they would save the territory of Jammu and Kashmir from terrorists and so on. But their claims are so self-contradictory. What they have ushered in is Indian state terrorism, brutalization of the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and destruction of their economy. And in fact, now what they're doing is that they are dispossessing the people of Jammu and Kashmir, They have turned the Kashmiris into aliens in their own homeland. So yes, these were their designs right from the beginning, but the course that occupation is taking is even more sinister and more dangerous than their original designs.
When you talk of the course that has been taken by the BJP government, what about silencing the voices of the politicians who have been trying to voice that of the oppressed people of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, whether it be Mehbooba Mufti, whether it be the Kashmiri leaders, whether it be also the other leaders? You remember how other party leaders were not even allowed to enter Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir in the beginning.
You know, what India is doing in the occupied territory is fascism, plain and simple. You read the laws which were introduced by Nazis in the last century, or the fascists, or the Milosevic in the Balkans. So you would see, or what Israel has been doing in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. India is doing exactly the same thing. It is trying to replicate those models. By India, I do not mean 1.3 billion people of India. What I mean is Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and the Bharatiya Janata Party, this duo, this combine, this vicious combine, which is imposing Hindu supremacist doctrine on the entire population of India and on the entire neighborhood of South Asia. So this is what they're trying to do, and their actions in Kashmir stem from that doctrine. So this is one thing. And what was your point, the other question that you had asked?
My point was, sir, where the silencing of the voices,
yes,
the sane voices.
Let me tell you, let me differentiate between the two sets of leadership. One is, of course, the loyalists, like Farooq Abdullah, like Umar Abdullah, Mehbooba Mufti. I think they're criminals. They were and are co-conspirators. In fact, there was the so-called loyalists, and they were used by India to legitimize their illegal occupation in the territory since 1947. Now this is the third generation, as far as Abdullahs are concerned. This is the third generation of dynastic rule there. And they were trying to facilitate Indian occupiers, Indian terrorists in brutalizing the people of Jammu and Kashmir. So their hands are not clean. The second set of leadership is the Hurriyat leadership, or the pro-freedom leaders there, or pro-Pakistan leaders, or pro-self-determination leaders. And they've been giving sacrifices generation after generation. And as we speak today, all of them are in jails. I mean, Yasir Malik is in Tihar jail, and you have Asiya Indrabi, she is in Tihar jail, and so is Shabir Shah. And Sayyid Ali Gilani is confined to his home. There are restrictions on Mirwais, Umar Farooq. Ashraf Sahrai has been detained. Musarrat Alam Bhat. All these leaders have been detained, illegally detained. And so this is one aspect. Second is that these illegal incarcerations have not been confined to the top political leadership of the Kashmiris, or the true representatives of the Kashmiris. They have expanded the net, these occupation forces, and they have also incarcerated these young boys, 13,000 of them, including children as young as 10, 11, and 12. And CDS Bipin Rawat said some time ago, immediately after their incarceration, that these boys or young children were more lethal than the pellet-firing shotguns. And you know what his rationale was? That they chant the slogan of Azadi. So they have established these de-radicalization camps to change their ideology, to silence their voices, to muzzle their protest. So, and I call these boys, young boys, who fleeing their homes and without weapons and without any training, military training, they're trying to protect their homes and neighborhoods and their occupied territory, the territory that has been occupied by the enemy. So these are the real heroes. There's also a third category which is emerging. You know, what India does is that it enlists the support of loyalists like Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah and Farooq Abdullah, Mehbooba Mufti, and then uses them. And after uses them, throws them away like used tissue, right? So this is what they have done with their loyalists so far. They do not represent the Indian interest or the Kashmiri interest, which they never represented. But what they're trying to do is to groom a new set of leaders, a new set of Mir Jafars and Mir Sadaqs, a new set of traitors who would side with India and try to legitimize India's illegal occupation and colonization of the territory.
All these measures that you've talked about, sir, can they be called the hallmarks of a so-called largest democracy of the world? Can India, in reality, now be called a democracy?
You know, India's democracy, or the credentials of India's democracy, have always been questionable. And go back to 1947, from then to this day, it is the largest democracy, but it doesn't mean that it is a perfect democracy. No democracy is perfect. I mean, particularly in the developing countries, you have many challenges with large populations. But you know, what I want to highlight is that go back to 1947, India got independence on August the 15th. But months later, on October the 27th, 1947, when they occupied the one chunk of the territory of Jammu and Kashmir, India became a colonial state. I mean, it's a democracy and it is a colonial power. It is a colonial power for many other states in India, for instance, which it usurped, like Junagadh or Hyderabad or Sikkim or even Goa to some extent, or and what it has been doing in the neighborhood. So it acts as an imperialistic or colonial power. So its democracy is tainted with this kind of evil ambition. And Kashmir is part of that. Kashmir is the prime target of that kind of Lebensstorm.
When you talk of this evil ambition of India and you go back to 1947, why haven't organizations such as the United Nations, the OSCE, the European Union, or countries that can impact India to change its stance, like the United States or the United Kingdom, made an effort to put pressure on India?
You know, the United Nations remained a symbol of the New World Order, and it was a respected institution. But in the post-Cold War period and post-9/11 period, it started losing its legitimacy and its effectiveness. The United States went to Iraq without the consent of the United Nations, and when it had invaded the territory, there was this coalition of the willing. It went back to the United Nations for rubber stamping the decision which the most powerful nation on earth had taken at that time. So at that time there was this buzz of the unipolar world. So the world order was led by the United States. After that, the United Nations clout started decreasing. And today, the United Nations Secretary General has all the authority to moralize and to issue statements, or the United Nations Security Council has confined its activities to the conflict areas in Africa, but beyond that, it doesn't have any international writ. I mean, this organization was based on the principle of international rule of law, but it has been sidelined. There are muscular nations who take the decisions, and these muscular nations, I would, on top of that list is the United States. And the United States is right now aligned very closely with India, and therefore they do not objectively look at Kashmir. They look at Kashmir through the prism of India, prism of Delhi. So that's what. But what I want to tell you is that despite this diminution in the stature of the United Nations is still important because it symbolizes the international community. If you have to think of international community, in a formal sense, it would be the United Nations, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and all other affiliated bodies of the United Nations. So I think that it is a wise policy adopted by our government to go back to the United Nations and its affiliated institutions in regard to the rights of the Kashmiris. And this is making a difference. In addition, in the past year, we've gone to the most powerful parliaments in the world, the European Parliament, the British House of Commons and the British House of Lords, or the US Congress, both houses. US Congress was very important because Indian lobbyists had made sure, after hard work for years, that nobody would speak up against India in regard to Kashmir or other issues in the US Congress. They had managed it very well, but that taboo was broken last year in the aftermath of the Indian actions in Kashmir and the ensuing brutalities. So what I want to say is that international community, the United Nations, world parliaments, international media, and particularly international civil society are very important for galvanizing support for Kashmir.
When you talk of galvanizing support for Kashmir, what we've seen as a change from the last few years is the media, the international media, talking about the Kashmir issue in a very open manner, as it never used to do in the past. What has changed?
This kind of opportunity was there for us for only 3 months, and I would say August, September and October. These 3 months, the international media, led by the United States media, and also the most powerful media houses and networks, they focused on Kashmir, and they were appalled. And that momentum in regard to the attention to Kashmir continued for a while, and it was increased in the wake of the actions that Indian police and forces had taken in New Delhi or UP after the passage of this Citizenship Amendment Act, because everybody was appalled that this is happening in the so-called, as you said, the largest democracy in the world. But then that groundswell of support or that heightened attention towards Kashmir petered out. We had our own internal problems in Pakistan, and the world was distracted because of other developments, political developments, and then COVID-19 pandemic. So we do not have that attention that we had in the immediate aftermath of August the 5th actions of India, August the 5th actions of India. So that's where we are. In fact, right now our challenge is to regain that traction which was available to us last year.
All right. When you talk of regaining traction, what are the possible methods through which we could do so, or we are doing?
One of your assets is your diaspora community. They are all over the world. Their number should be 10 million. Their largest number is in United Kingdom, Europe, North America, the Gulf region, also the Asia Pacific region. So they are there everywhere. And whenever there is a call for protest, usually that community responds to the Kashmiris' call or Pakistan's call. And they have, I would say, over the years, these diaspora community members have transformed the Kashmir cause into an international movement. So they are a big asset. Then, of course, these community members have networks working with the local parliamentarians or councillors, think tanks, and media houses. So that is our entry point, so to say, into the world opinion. I think that I was talking to another anchor person of Pakistan television a short while ago, and I highlighted that point, and I want to repeat it, that we have to build up a crescendo, like the anti-apartheid campaign or the Vietnam movement. the movement against the war in Vietnam. And this is our Vietnam moment. And we have to reach that critical point so that we can make a difference. The world opinion matters because India would respond to only two things. One is some sort of military resistance, and the other is the international opinion.
When you talk of change of international opinion and the crescendo that we need to reach, when you see the United States openly aligning with India, and as you said earlier in the interview, that their mindset is totally pro-India as far as the Kashmir issue is concerned, how can then even all our efforts put in a solid effect as far as change in attitude in India is concerned? We have been doing that. Our Prime Minister has talked about it at different fora. Our Foreign Minister has talked about it. You yourself, sir, have gone to so many countries and talked about the Kashmir issue, and I have highlighted it in different sessions. But what is really lacking, that little point for which we can achieve that crescendo that you so talked about?
Our narrative is not as strong as India's. India is telling lies and propagating them, like they say that it's a bilateral matter. The Jammu and Kashmir dispute is a bilateral matter. It is not. If it was bilateral, last year on August the 5th or August the 4th, India would have consulted Pakistan about the measures it has taken inside the occupied territory. But it said at that time that it's a unilateral, it's a domestic matter, right? So the other lie they tell the world is that they are fighting terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. There are no terrorists there. I mean, their security officials say that there are only 230 militants there, and these are boys who fled their homes to resist 900,000 soldiers. This is highly asymmetric. I mean, ill-equipped, ill-trained boys confronting one of the strongest armies in the world, armed to teeth. So you have that kind of disproportionality here. So they are not fighting terrorists. They're brutalizing unarmed, non-combatant civilians. This is what is happening there. And the number of the civilians is 14 million, out of which about 80 to 90 million are Muslims. So what I'm saying is that if we strengthen our narrative, if we broadcast it widely, then we would be able to defeat, repulse India's false propaganda against the Kashmiris, against Pakistan, and against Muslims in general.
All right. When you talk of propaganda, you mentioned time and again during this interview and in the past as well the role of the youth. You talked about Vipin Rawat's statement on the youth, and of course the youth who have now come up since Burhan Wani's martyrdom as well as a huge force to be reckoned with in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. How important do you feel is the role of the youth in order to put forward this whole movement for the rights of the people of Indian occupied Kashmir?
Youth is very important. I think that if you look at demography of Kashmir, 60 to 64% are young men and women, including children, of course, and this century belongs to them. The first half of century belongs to them. Many of them are millennials. So what you see is that this youth, not only in Kashmir, but in Azad Kashmir, Pakistan, and all around the world, they are ready to play their role. What we lack right now is leadership. I don't mean that we do not have leaders. We have spokespersons and we have representatives who raise the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. But what I mean is a strong coalition of young leadership, which would take the baton and take the freedom struggle to the next stage, where we start producing results. Because at the moment what we're doing is that we are counting our dead bodies, and we are citing the number of women who have been raped. We are also talking about extrajudicial killings and disappearances, unmarked graves, and so we are compiling these reports and trying to get the attention of the international community.
But you know,
we have to go a step forward.
all right.
And we have to create an environment for results, for justice, for the realization of the right to self-determination by the entire population of Jammu and Kashmir.
There should be an environment for results, and we are trying, I mean, at least for our level best, to do that on different fora. And you yourself, sir, are one of those who are trying that on different fora. But when you talk of the role of media that we have highlighted, when you talk of the role of politicians, of the youth of Pakistan, in all of this comes also the role of the important powers that be, and the role of organizations. We've talked about the United Nations, but we haven't talked about the OIC. The OIC recently also took out certain statements in favor of Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Do you feel that the OIC could also play an important role?
I would give you a testimony, contrary to what most of the people believe, that since 1990, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has extended full and very robust support to the right to self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Year after year, in ministerial conferences and in periodic summits, they have been condemning Indian actions, India's human rights violations. They, starting last year, I mean, they condemned Indian actions on August the 5th, and subsequent steps that it took. It has also recently condemned new domicile rules, which is a strategy to enslave or displace the people of Jammu and Kashmir, or reduce them into second-rate citizens. It has been your ally, and we're thankful to the entire organization for the strong solidarity it has demonstrated towards the people of Jammu and Kashmir. But there are two things that I want to highlight. One is that the OIC is not a decision-making body like the United Nations. You know, United Nations Charter gives certain powers to the Security Council under Chapter 7. I mean, when a country is not behaving or it is pursuing genocide, the United Nations Security Council has the right to intercede without seeking concurrence of that country. This has happened in Africa many times. It can also send its peacekeeping forces there, and you have United Nations peacekeeping contingents in which Pakistani forces have also participated all over the world, particularly in Africa, some in Latin America, some in Asia, but mainly, or the Balkans, but mainly in Africa. Now, the OIC doesn't have that kind of capacity according to its own charter. It can only produce soft international law, or it can only give declaratory support to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, a moral support, a political support, but decision-making lies with the United Nations Security Council. The second point that I want to highlight, and this is very important, that while the OIC as a body is supportive of the Kashmiris, there are some individual members, very influential members. They have very close ties with India, economic ties and trade ties, and that restrains their articulation on the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. Not their street, not their population, but the governments. So we face a dilemma there. But we also have very close ties with these countries. So, I mean, it's a predicament. So the path that our government has chosen, which is, I think, a wise and prudent path, is to engage these powerful nations within the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and ask them to use their clout with India to stop these killings in Kashmir and to stop grabbing the land of the Indians.
All right.
of the Kashmiris.
You talked about regional influence, you talked about OIC. Let's come a little bit closer to India and Pakistan, the countries in the region. We've seen how tensions have also erupted between India and China on Ladakh, on the LAC. We've seen the tensions erupt between India and Nepal, India and Bhutan, India and Bangladesh. Can we, the countries that are now affected by these regional tensions, get together and set up a united front against all the atrocities that India is committing in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir?
I don't think that would be feasible, but because we are pursuing a policy of peace and security in the region, we do not want turbulence. India is inciting hatred against its neighbors, against its own citizens, and of course, it is killing and torturing Kashmiris. I mean, that is their policy. And they have this grand agenda of becoming the hegemon of this region. And that's why they took on China, or they keep threatening Pakistan. And they want these smaller states in South Asia to be subjugated to the Indian influence. And this is not happening. And they are quite frustrated about it. So I would say, and the kind of scenario that you are building, this could, of course, lead towards a war that could be very costly. A conventional war between Pakistan and India, for instance, could spiral to the nuclear level. Or a clash between India and China could also have dire strategic and economic consequences. So, but at the same time, I would say that we have strong alignment with China, both at the diplomatic level and at the military level, the strategic level. And CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is part of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, further cements the ties between the two countries. So we have very secure flank, very, very strong alignment with one of the permanent members of the Security Council. We also have friendly relations with other nations of the South Asian region. And I think because of Pakistan's constructive role in regard to Afghanistan, the relations between Islamabad and Washington have also improved. Pakistan is a big country, a nuclear weapon state with a bright future ahead. So it should cultivate Western countries, cultivate its relations with Western countries so that it has more diplomatic space. And that space would not come through wars, that would come through assertive and effective and result-oriented diplomacy and political outreach.
All right, you talked about political outreach, but at the same time, sir, you talked about threats coming from India towards Pakistan. We can obviously see an example of that in the increased number of violations across the line of control this year. Just this year, they have increased much more than the previous years. Also, the constant threat of a false flag operation that also has been highlighted by our Prime Minister, by our Foreign Minister, and yourself as well. How much of that is a possibility?
This menace is always there because Indian military commanders and their political leadership and their intelligence agencies have planning and plotting against Pakistan, against Azad Kashmir, Gilgit-Baltistan. They launch these low-cost fake operations, and then through propaganda they try to make their citizens believe that these were real operations, like the surgical strikes of 2016. There was no surgical strike, or violation of our airspace last year, and then of course they lost one aircraft, and their pilot became a prisoner of war, but they turned that prisoner of war into a hero. So they're past masters in telling lies. So what I'm saying is that this false flag operation, which means that fake terrorist account or stage managed by the agencies themselves, and then holding Pakistan responsible for that, and then taking some sort of action, some low-cost maneuver to provoke Pakistan so that Pakistan can respond. So this is what they can do. You cannot rule it out. Would they start a conventional, full-fledged conventional war? No. Hypothetically speaking, if there's a conventional war between Pakistan and India, without the war escalating to the nuclear level, even then they would be defeated because of soldiering, because of generalship, because of command and control, because of the experience of actual wars. Because let me highlight here that Indian experience, I mean, look at their history, they usually disarm people and then kill them, and usually disarm civilians and kill them in their own state, and of course in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. They do not have the capacity to face an equal and defeat it. So what I'm saying is that they would not take that risk. They're collecting these Rafales and MiGs, and they think that they would be secure. But basically, they are an insecure force, and as it was exposed, during the China-India standoff. Their bravado about their muscularity was exposed in a very stark manner.
In all of this exposure of bravado of India, how important does the role of the current leadership in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, the Kashmiri freedom fighters I'm talking about, becomes? And how long do you see this fight continuing in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir before some kind of a logical conclusion comes out, or maybe they get their right to self-determination? Because on one hand, sir, I'm sorry to put this question on a bit length, but on one hand, we have the movement, but on the other hand, we have all the laws that are being placed in by India, and the last one being, of course, a domicile law that puts Hindus as part of the population of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. What then? How long? Or will we have to wait a long time?
We should not wait for a long time, because a British economist, Keynes, once said that in the long run we all die, and Kashmiris are dying today, and you have to protect and defend them. If you do not protect and defend them today, then it would be too late. And the second thing is that you talked about promulgation of these laws and rules. They are having a devastating impact on the lives of the Kashmiris. I mean, the economy has been ruined. They are confined to their houses. They have no civil liberties or fundamental freedoms. And you know, you must have seen some Bollywood movies, and these movies have vicious villains. I mean, they're part of the plot. But if you collect all those villains and call it RSS or BJP, you would have personified them. You would have aggregated all those villains, because they are using all those villainous tactics of brutality, of chicanery, of manipulation in Kashmir to consolidate their illegitimate rule. But I think that they would not succeed. They would not succeed because the history is on the side of the Kashmiris, and the Kashmiris haven't given up or capitulated for the past 7 decades, or for the past 200 years if you also include the Maharaja's rule. They are not going to capitulate. So we've seen it in the last century, and you open the books of history. When a people decide that they would get their liberty and freedom, no power on earth can stop from attaining that goal. And this is what is going to happen in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. We are thankful to the state of Pakistan, to the people of Pakistan, who have always stood by Kashmiris, and now they're projecting their voices to the most influential international forums in the world.
Thank you very much, sir, to have given us such an important, valuable input on what is happening in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, especially since the last 1 year. All that has happened there, all that we are doing, all that you, sir, yourself are doing as well as an effort so that the people of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir can finally get their due right to self-determination. They can decide what they want to do with their lives. Ladies and gentlemen, this very day, 5th of August, will always be remembered as that day when India further curtailed the rights of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir and their hapless citizens that are still under subjugation. We are with them. We will remain with them politically, morally, diplomatically. We wish them a speedy resolution of all their issues, including their right to self-determination, especially on this very important day. Allah Hafiz, thank you very much, and may Kashmir get its due right very, very soon. And thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.